Achtung, the Vogt through YouTube. It's me again, your pal Kaiser Nani, and we're back again with another exciting episode of Let's Explain Victoria 2. Today we're talking about one of the most important parts of the entire game, that being politics. You see, politics is the benchmark for most of the things that you do in Victoria 2. After all, you are playing effectively as nothing but a head of state, so being able to manage your population is important. And how do you do that? Why, you do that via politics. So, some of the more important factors of politics involve the parties and the reforms. So, let's just get those squared off right away. Now, at the very beginning of the game, you're only going to have to be dealing with three major parties. Those are going to be the Conservatives, the Liberals, and the Reactionaries. Now, all of these other parties, aside from Fascists and Communists, exist to a degree in politics, but until a specific event happens that enables them in the world, they can't muster enough support in anyone to actually develop as a real party. So, you're only going to see in your upper house, or as your head of state, one of those three major parties until they start activating some of those other events. So it's quite important to be familiar with them. On top of that, these three parties, well, in particular, Liberals and Conservatives, are going to be your two most important parties for most countries in the world, as they will be the only real parties that can generally win the elections without your help, so it's important to be acclimated with them. So first off, we have the Liberals. Now, Americans in particular are probably going to want to listen to this, because even if you know what an American liberal is, and I apologize for the noise right there, even if you know what an American liberal is, in Victoria 2, it's using the period-accurate European style of liberal. Liberals want reforms in political tabs, but they don't want anything to happen as far as social reforms. Effectively, think of them as the libertarians. They want more rights for the public, but they don't want a welfare state, and they will often be seen backing economic policies like free trade, laissez-faire, which basically means the government does not intervene in the economy at all, and generally things like pluralism, limited or free citizenship, and so on. Conservatives are effectively the NA party. What a conservative in Victoria 2 is a complete status quo guy. Conservatives want no change from as things are, and in most situations that's going to be a very dominating thought in this time period. They'll generally be a little bit on the right as far as economic and political policies go, but they will never really back a reform in any direction unless there is extreme duress. They'll often be backing protectionism, they'll be backing economic, particularly they'll be backing interventionism, they'll often be going for moralism, residency, or limited citizenship, and usually will be pro-military. The reactionaries can be thought of as sort of a stem from the conservatives, and indeed, they do pool together in elections, so if there is a plurality, conservatives and reactionaries will go together. So will liberals and anarcho-liberals, but that will so very rarely actually change anything that might as well not really be the case. Fascists don't go with anybody. So, and obviously, socialists and communists also pool together. So that being said, reactionaries hate all of these things. Reactionaries don't want social reforms, reactionaries don't want political reforms. In fact, since we have a majority reactionary upper house right now, we could roll back one of these reforms. I don't really want to do that, but you can. Generally, you don't want to be outright moving backwards as far as reforms go, unless you're attempting to become absolute monarchy or presidential dictatorship, or occasionally just straight up a fascist dictatorship, but that will so very rarely actually be the case that let's just say that for the most part, you're never going to be wanting to move back. So reactionaries play a dangerous game. However, they are very much statists. They very much enjoy a powerful state, so you will always see them with protectionism. You will always see them with state capitalism. You'll usually see them with moralism and residency, and you will always see them with jingoism. And all of those things are really important, because those are very strong policies to have as a smaller nation as we are here. So basically, reactionaries suck to deal with in the upper house, but as a head of state, they're one of the better parties you can get, and probably the best for the early game if you're trying to expand your nation. Usually, the first new party that comes along is the anarcho-liberal. And basically, just think of them as, unlike the liberals, who will at least tolerate social reforms going down, but they will never back them, anarcho-liberals actively want social reforms completely rolled back. They don't support the status quo. They basically want no social reforms, as we can see over there. They're the more hardcore sorts of libertarians, and they will always support any political reform down. Well, almost always, unless they're in power. Anarcho-liberals will be one of your most common rebels you'll see. Only very rarely will you actually see them win. As you could probably imagine by their name, they are very prone to violence, and you're going to very rarely are you going to be dealing with a lot of them in the upper house. I cannot think of really a single time when I've seen anarcho-liberals actually pull more than 5%. And I don't think I could ever say I've seen them pull more than 10. It's a rare case. So you would have, if you really want anarcho-liberals to be in power, and that's a very strange thing to want, you're going to have to put a lot of time and effort into it, and I will warn you in advance, it might not be worth it. Soon after them come the Socialists, and basically they're kind of the opposites of liberals. They always want social reforms, but they don't really want political reforms. Not enough that they want them rolled back, but enough that they want the status quo on them. Socialists are another common revolter. Revolt with about the same frequency as liberals or reactionaries, which is to say, from time to time, but not terribly often. Usually, if there's any new party that's going to take traction, it's going to be the Socialists, so that's not too bad, though, because you generally, especially in the base game, you're going to want social reforms. It's as simple as that. Especially school system and healthcare are definitely you're going to want them in every game. They give you better education standards and a higher population growth with literally no downside at all. So socialists aren't a terrible thing, but you probably also don't want them to take power, or else it will be very difficult to do anything politically, and you might end up raking the bank on some of those reforms, because max work hours and safety regulations hurt your factories as well as minimum wage, and unemployment subsidies and pensions are charged to you. They're charged to your budget. That's what that other category is out there that you might have saw was doing nothing in the first episode, and you will see is doing nothing when we get to it. They will break the bank. They will hurt your economy. So be careful when you're dealing with those. Basically, you want a healthy socialist population, but not a dominant one. I should also mention, anarcho-liberals will generally hold the same principles as liberals when it comes to policy. Socialists will basically, ironically, they'll keep basically everything a lot of things in common with reactionaries, except they'll generally go for a more atheistic religious policy, and generally be more against the military. Communists, as aforementioned, pull with socialists, and are basically to them what the anarcho-liberals are to liberals. They revolt more often, and instead of just wanting social reforms passed through and status quo on political, they want political reforms actively rolled back. Again, very rarely will you see a huge communist population without prior help, because most of the people who would be communists tend to just go socialist instead. And so, again, they generally do better than anarcho-liberals do, I find, but still, very rarely are they going to be making a huge impact on the game. And speaking of basically never making a huge impact on the game, fascists are kind of a unique government form. Basically, the only time you're ever going to see fascists is if you have high revanchism here. We'll talk about that in a bit. Um, that's basically the only time you're going to see them, and their gimmick is that if they're currently in power, they will support anything you do. Any social reform up or down, any political reform up or down. They will be more skeptical about going down with political reforms, but if they're in power and they're the majority, then they will always support it. The only thing that they generally like to do as far as anything specific is that they really like to be the exclusive members of the upper house. Fascists are a really good government form to have if you haven't figured that out, or at least have them in power, which you can with most of the government forms. And but it takes a Herculean amount of effort to get them in power. For starters, they're generally going to come very late into the game. I've seen many games come and go where they didn't even spawn, where fascists simply never organized. And it's not a ideology that catches on with a lot of people, again, outside of revanchism. They will share they will always basically have just the same sort of policies as you will see in Reactionaries, which are going to be protectionism, state capitalism, moralism, residency, jingoism. As you can see here, that's very commonly what they'll support. And I should also mention, as one last side thing, that the communists will do everything the socialists do as far as policies go, except they will always support the most extreme economic policy, which actually slips my name, or which actually the name of it slips past me. I can't put the power to see. It's going to be planned economy. That's it. Communists will always support planned economy, which is the most extreme economic policy as far as social things goes, where capitalists are banned outright and you have to micromanage everything yourself, which, by the way, is hell. Some fascist parties worldwide will also support that, so be on the lookout, and some socialists as well, so be on the lookout for that. So, as far as mods go, I'm just going to touch on a few basic things considered this year's survival guide. Most ideologies that end with ists are driving for a specific government form. If you got monarchists, you can guess what they want. If you have fascists, as in base game, you know what they want. So on and so forth. They're mostly going to be very one-note sorts of parties, and if you don't know what they do exactly, hover over their slice on the pie, and you can see generally what they're going to want to see. So, one of the most common ideologies you're going to see is social democrats, who are going to always want to see both political and economic reforms go through. If you've seen Up the Man mod, you've seen them, and it's kind of strange how you don't see them in base game, probably because they're ludicrously powerful to have for a bigger nation. If you're a huge empire, you're always going to want them in power, so obviously take that as it stands. If you're a huge empire, your economy is running itself, and you have no real problems, you always want the social democrats. Beyond that, as I said, if you don't know what they do, take a look at their slice of pie. And you will always see. There's also the separatists and anti-separatists, and they're just dumb. Don't worry about them. If you see a faction like that, again, that's a Pod the Man mod thing. Don't worry about them. They don't do anything as far as politics goes. So now let's talk about our political and social reforms. So slavery, that's a pretty binary thing. You can have slaves or you cannot have slaves. Very rarely are you going to do anything significant with allowing slavery, and they're literally better off in the RGO normally because they do Because slaves, once released, will turn into different types of population, and they will do a better job as a farmer than they would a former slave. The only good thing about them, and this is hardly one, is that they can do multiple things under the same role. In other words, if they want to move, they don't have to turn into a different pop type. They will just move to, they'll move and just become a miner or whatever. And that's still not good. You basically always want slavery to be outlawed. The upper house determines, effectively, how powerful a state is or isn't, for determining who gets into your upper house, which is, this thing over here. Which, by the way, I should mention, this doesn't determine who is in office outright, or your ruling party, in other words, so be mindful of that. Ruling party only does exactly what you would expect it to be. If I chose that right now, everybody here would turn into a reactionary. Appointed is the most basic sort of system, which basically means that your rich voters, which you can always see your vote franchise down here. And generally you're not going to have appointed and anything but only landed, but either way. So all your rich people will be voting on who's in your upper house, and this is something important to keep in mind of, because if you've got a really expanded vote franchise but you only have appointed in the upper house, you might be seeing some weird discrepancies between your voter ideologies and how elections go versus how your upper house goes, so be very mindful of this. 2 per state basically gives each state equal representation in the house no matter its population, whereas based on population will be a very direct sort of system. Now, this is an interesting little dilemma for every state, and I would consider both of these as equally sort of the last political reform here. And I should also mention, very rarely is anybody going to be pushing for reform for this, aside from ruling party to appointed, and from that to one of the 2 last ones. Basically, the 2 per state versus based on population choice is basically completely dependent on how the situation in your country is going and where you want to drive things. If a specific party is taking complete hold in a country like, well, say, us, where we basically have Guatemala City, San Salvador, and Camagüey, and everywhere else is just really low population, but these places are liberal as nothing else, and you want the conservatives in power, you want to take 2 per state. Conversely, if you wanted those liberals, you would always go for based on population. See how that works? It's quite simple. Now, vote franchise determines who's in power outright, because those are going to determine who wins an election, or, well, if there are elections at all. If there's no voting, well, there's no voting. Nobody is allowed to participate in an election, and you pick your ruling party outright via this button. Only landed means rich vote, weighted wealth means rich and middle class, but rich people are worth more. Wealth means both of them are equal. Weighted universal means that the rich and middle votes count for middle class votes, count for more than the lower class votes, and universal means everybody is allowed to vote and everybody's votes count equally. Effectively, again, this is a place to be quite careful. You might think logically that the rich are going to be always in favor of a reactionary or conservative sort of government, so if you want to keep that sort of thing, you would always stay on only landed, but in actuality, the aristocrat population, which makes up a good portion, is almost always going to be going liberal, because they want part of the chunk of that power, you see, and that's an easy way to get it. So, if you want a more conservative populace, it might actually be a better idea to go to Universal. And certainly, if you want to be going for any of those parties that pop up during the game, which is going to be everything but reactionary, conservative, and liberal, then you definitely want to be going that way, because the rich populations, and in fact the middle class, will basically never be backing anything more than those 3. And you can see that here, because we have a weighted vote franchise now, and none of the new parties are polling even above 3%, so that should tell you. And of course, this is upper house, and you can see it down here. It's even worse for ideology. About everybody is, all the new parties are 3%. So, the voting system, I'm not gonna lie, I've never really figured out exactly what this does. Logically, it seems like that would change, say, how votes are tallied for results, but I'm just gonna say it like it is. This doesn't really do anything you need to know about, and you can't really game this. So, just, if the people want it, go for it. If not, stay out of it. If there's no movement going and you just want to please the population, this is a good way to get people to stop being mad at you without actually doing anything as far as your country goes. At least not in base. It does change how votes are tallied for your upper house and your ruling party in several mods, but in base game, it doesn't seem to do very much, so don't worry about it. Like I always said, if it doesn't seem to do anything, it's probably not doing much. Public meetings are quite simple. If public meetings are allowed, then people are more aware about what's happening politically. We'll get to what that means in a little bit. If they're not allowed, then nobody has any clue what's going on. And of course, that means that they'll be less angry by the actions that you personally take. If you're going to try and go for a communist or fascist nation at the end of the game, you definitely want to not have meetings allowed, or else people will get really mad every reform you roll back. Press rights does effectively the same thing. Simple as that. It just does the same thing as public meetings. Trade unions make people more involved with social reforms, and you're basically not going to get one until you're all allowed. Of course, you usually get all allowed pretty early into the game, but that's just how it goes. If you want to do a lot of social reforms, you get yourself some trade unions. Political parties is interesting, because not only do these policies determine basically if you're cheating in elections, because if you have the closer you are to secret ballots, the less influence the ruling party has over the elections. But also, gerrymandering here is an important political party policy outright, because that's where most governments will fully change into the most liberal form of such. For instance, a monarchy that gets landed voting will turn into a Prussian constitution, and if that gets gerrymandering, they turn into a HM's government, which, again, we'll talk about that. There's going to be a lot to talk about, so just know that gerrymandering changes your government type for a lot of governments. Now over on social reforms, minimum wage, maximum work hours, and safety regulations effectively do the same thing, which is increase the upkeep cost of factories. Unemployment subsidies and pensions put more of a dent into your budget, while healthcare and school systems going closer to the bottom here are universally good things. And of course, generally, aside from healthcare and school system, you don't want to be backing a lot of these social reforms unless you're America or a country in the New World specifically and you want to get a lot of immigrants in. Think about healthcare, think about the school system. Otherwise, try to resist these, because they just make your factories output less and all that. Eventually, in a lot of cases, you will have to throw out there and give the people what they want, but for the most part, that's that. Now, let's talk about some other things that we can see on the screen. First off, we're going to talk about some simple stuff. Plurality is the shared level of consciousness in our country, the memories of past victories and defeats in the name of liberty to remind of our people of what could be. This doesn't tell you a thing if you've noticed. Basically, plurality is your people's desire to be great as a nation. Just think of that effectively as your nationalism stat. For the most part, you want that to go higher. It does increase consciousness quite a bit, but it also increases things like research speed. It increases how many people you can mobilize. It's a good thing to have. So when events come up that say that they're going to give you more or take away some of your plurality, think of that as a very big stat. If nothing else, this is one of the most important numbers on this entire screen and maybe the entire HUD, so be very conscious of this. Conversely, there's its evil twin, revanchism. Revanchism basically means, as you can see here, the French word for revenge. Revanchism is effectively the way that the game tries to keep you playing if you lose a war. It's not entirely successful on that matter, because even high revanchism will not put you on the same level as that country that just won, but hey, what can you do? Revanchism comes from losing wars in general. Even if it's only a minor defeat, or even if it's, say, you're the war leader and you give up some of the territory of a smaller nation side, you will get some revanchism. And basically, this will drive... The main factor of this is that it makes your country a lot better at fighting. People are really pissed and they want to take it to the enemy. It will make you a lot better and faster at justifying wars, and it will generally push your population towards more jingoistic war policies, which will obviously as well make all those things happen more often. It'll get more people to turn into soldiers, and it'll get them to do so more easily. Basically, every point of revanchism turns your country into more of a military dictatorship. If you want to become more of a reactionary, fascist, or even communist nation early on, it might be even good to throw a war in which you lose some minor strip of territory or something like that to push your country into more revanchism, so that they'll be more accepting of a rollback of political reform, so long as you eventually win that war back. Of course, that's not always a good thing. If you have high revanchism and you're not really doing anything about taking your territory back, your people will not be happy about that, and you might see a lot of revolts. You might see a lot of revolts with Plurality as well, but that's not such a big deal. So, with that being said, let's now talk about this part here. This button controls your ruling party. Well, this shows you the potential ruling parties you could have. Basically, anybody you see here is actually liable to win an election. You might notice that most of the new parties are missing, aside from the anarcho-liberals. They'll eventually show up here, but for now, this is our four parties. These basically represent the major parties that actually have a shot of winning your country's ruling party slot, which you can see up here. And your ruling party controls your policies. Policies are pretty big. So it's very important to be conscious of your ruling party, and of course, usually if you're going to try and move your country in a direction, it's because of this. Trade policy is simple. There's free trade and protectionism. If you got free trade, you don't have tariffs. If you got protectionism, you do have tariffs. Simple as that. We'll talk about tariffs more in the budget episode. Your economic policy is laissez-faire. I'm sorry, I probably botched that. Interventionism, state capitalism, and planned economy. Basically, if you're laissez-faire, you don't intervene in the economy at all. You can't build factories, you can't build railroads, you can't do anything. The only thing you can invest in is other countries, and that's it. On the other hand, it also makes capitalists very important as far as your country goes, but also makes them a lot more powerful, gives them a lot of perks and benefits. Of course, more of that dollar. That's a very risky thing to go for. So I would generally try to, unless you're really confident in your economy, I would generally try to stay at least on interventionism. Interventionism lets you subsidize factories, which basically means you pay for their operation in exchange for them never going down, and lets you build railroads. Capitalists don't have perks, and your tax rate takes a little bit of your tax rate can go higher, but is a less efficient draw. Generally, I like to stay on interventionism if I can help it, because I can usually direct the economy pretty well. Early in the game, you probably want state capitalism, since that is the most basic economic policy that lets you, for most nations, directly build factories. Obviously, railroads as well. This helps you develop an industry where prior there was none. This is great for if you're trying to expand your industry, even if it's after just a lost war. It's something you really want to do, because it'll help you specifically pick out industries of interest. We'll talk more about what industries you want or maybe don't want in a situation in the production episode, but to keep it simple right now, let's just say that you want factories generally to be making things you're producing, to be in populated centers, and to be in good infrastructure. Planned economy completely removes capitalists from this equation at all and gives you a nice minimum tax rate. And it basically means that you have to do every single little bitty thing in your country. And if you're really patient, if you're really a micromanager, or if you're on a smaller nation geographically, but with a good population, which you're going to see a lot of in Europe, it's good for Switzerland, it's good for Luxembourg, if you really want to be Luxembourg, it's good for Denmark, places like that. If you're at a small but very dense sort of nation, it's a great thing for that, but if you're not, it's about the worst thing in the world, because it means you will have to do everything. Luckily, for most nations, only the communists are going to back that. Sometimes you'll see socialists and rarely fascists will be backing it, but for the most part, it's not something you're going to need to worry about unless you lose in a rebellion and communists take over. Religious policy, well, I'll forecast it with this. Religion in Victoria 2 is such a minor thing that you're very rarely going to be even thinking about this. I usually just use religious policy as a way to try to guide the people to the political party that I want in power the most, because I feel like I can generally have whatever religious policy I want with no real good or ill effects. But to be, completely, I guess, to give you the whole shebang, moralism means your country has an official religion and does not tolerate any other ones. Pluralism means that your country has an official religion but still tolerates others. Secularized means that you have no official religion whatsoever, well, maybe a slight preference for one, but it is completely separated church and state, while state atheism means that no religions are supported and all are persecuted to some degree. And again, that has such a small bearing on Victoria 2 and is important for so few countries that, again, it's not really a lot worth considering. A religion that's not supported will find it harder to adapt into your society, and basically a double-edged sword. They'll be more willing to convert to your state religion, but it will find it harder to integrate into society while that's happening, so they'll be a little bit more militant. But it's such a small degree, even within mods, I find that it's just... You want to use your religious policy. If your favorite political party has moralism, you want to go for moralism, or if they have plurality or secularized or so on, you want to go for that. That's basically what it's good for. And it's a very hot button issue with the citizens, so it's really good for steering a country. If you go for, say, for UCA, right? USCA, and I wanted to turn into a liberal country, well, all I would have to do would be to support secularization for a couple of years, and it would flip pretty fast. That's about it. Citizenship policy has 3 tiers: residency, limited citizenship, and full citizenship. Now, unlike the last one, this is pretty important. In residency, you only tolerate your main culture and only they can vote, as well as any accepted ones you have. Limited citizenship allows more people to come in, and it basically gives minor tolerance to these new cultures, but and some can vote. I believe it actually is only not moralism. In residency, only your primary can vote, and in limited, citizens accepted can vote. We'll talk more about those actually today, but we'll be elaborating on it at a future time, of course. And basically, it's the middle ground option, and full citizenship lets everybody come to your country and vote no matter what. Now, of course, there's a good and downside to both ways. Basically, the more oppressive you are of a citizen, if you don't acknowledge, rights or let him vote or all that, he'll be far more willing to convert to your culture of choice, but he will also be a lot madder. And in this case, these modifiers are heavy enough that you will need to take consideration of them. Of course, limited citizenship is the middle ground choice, where you have average speed on both directions, and in full citizenship, where everybody's, accepted and all that, nobody will ever be converting, and that can be a big problem, especially in mods, when you need, like PDM, again, where you're going to need specific basically your main culture to be equipped as proper infantry, or if you're trying to go for a specific political party and maybe a certain culture only likes party X and you don't want that, sometimes you will want to go to your change population to your primary culture, and if you are full citizenship, that's hard to do. Um, Citizenship policy, and for that matter, religious policy, what vary wildly by political party and by nation. So several times you'll see that, it's not going to be every liberal party is secularized. It's not going to be every conservative and reactionary party or moral, and every anarcho-liberal is going to be state atheism. You'll see several variations basically all around the globe, aside from, most Latin American countries are going to run them basically the same way, most African, most East Asian, so on. Finally, there's the war policy. Again, this one's another one that varies. Jingoism is a huge favor in favor of war. Pro-military is just not necessarily in favor of war, but certainly in favor of the army. Anti-military is against the army, and pacifism is completely against any forms of conflict at all. Basically, this is your detriment for a lot of parties. You always, I really mean this, you always want jingoism. I don't care what your playstyle is. You want more jingoism so you can do more of war, and you want people to be pro-military so they'll be more willing to join the army. So if you're running a political party with anti-military or pacifism, God forbid, think of that basically as your as the downside for having that specific political party. Again, most parties worldwide are going to be at least pro-militaries, but especially farther left sort of liberal parties, which you can imagine where those are going to be, places like Sweden, places like Germany, the German states, places like France even, are going to be more against the military, so be conscious of that, but always try to drive this basically towards jingoism. Even if you don't necessarily want a jingoist party in power, or or pro-military party in power, you still want to be encouraging people to go jingoistic or pro-military on the grounds that you always want a bigger army, you always want a better army. It's as simple as that. So, that's going to be your policies, and holding the election here just determines, throws in a new election, and the winner becomes the leading party. The vote franchise for this is the universal one, and you can see down here, the voter ideologies are the guys who are actually going to be in this election. For that matter, they also choose the upper house if that's elected. And you can also see important issues down here. Incidentally, the difference between voters and people's ideologies, obviously, is voters' ideologies is everybody enfranchised, everybody who can vote, and people's ideologies is your population as a whole. I find that even in more restricted franchises, very rarely are you going to see these very significantly. Finally, important issues. Again, you can see voters versus the public as a whole. Nobody cares about atheism, everybody likes interventionism. Conversely, because I had an election and I went for interventionism. So, that was a lot to say, but we're still not done. Movements are effectively what your people want. You can see rebels here as well. Now, if there's a lot of liberals in your upper house and you're not actually doing any liberal reforms, or if they're very popular with the population, then you'll see movements start to pop up here. You'll see the Jacobin movement, right? And basically that's your little guide to, if you want a reform, you don't know exactly which one to pick the one the movement's going for. You can also suppress. Sadly, I don't have an example here for you, which takes a few of these points away to get rid of that movement entirely. The factor of that, basically, the reason to do that, because they will almost always come back, and if they don't always come back, they'll just turn into rebels. The reason to do this is if you want a specific reform, or moreover, don't want a specific reform, but there's a huge demand. So let's give a direct example. Let's say you want wealth, right? But there's a huge push for secret ballots. you don't really want secret ballots, at least not right now. You squash that movement and you go for wealth voting. That way, it won't make all your people mad, because if you go for a reform that's not under a movement, everybody who's in that movement will get mad. And it'll keep moving those reforms forward. Of course, if people get mad enough, they will become rebels. Rebels can come in many shapes and sizes. Everything from pro-political parties to nationalists. For the most part, the game is very good at describing to you what rebels want and what they do. You can see it here, you know. They're revolutionaries that want fascism. They're battle trained, they want to overthrow everything and replace them with fascist states. You'll always basically be able to tell. These are very well written and very descriptive. I've already mentioned to you what descriptions do. Or decisions do, not descriptions. I don't know what's wrong with me. I guess this video's been running a little long. Decisions do exactly, what they say. Sometimes you'll have hidden decisions that only pop up after certain requirements. Sometimes you'll have decisions that go away if you don't do them in time. Basically, if you see a decision, especially if you see a new decision, you always want to read the description, you always want to see this is your requirements, and you always want to see this, which is what it does. Very important decisions. They could be some of the most powerful things, or they can do useless garbage like become Guatemala, which you're basically never going to want to do. If that's the case, also decisions like abandon Finland, if that's the case, you click this little check mark right here, and now it doesn't show up if you can do the requirements. I would release all these nations here, and not become Guatemala, so you can see. But I'm at war right now. A little tangle with Colombia over Panama. You know how it goes. So I can't exactly show you that. Finally, very simple rundown of your cultures. Up here on your diplomacy screen, and yes, this really is the only place to see it. Don't ask me why. The top culture is the primary culture, and then below that are your accepted cultures, and you can basically guess what they do from their descriptions. Some countries have special events that add, or in rare cases even remove, a primary or accepted culture from your nation. It's nice to have accepted cultures generally, because they're going to effectively act as your primary citizens. They're not going to really want to rebel, so on and so forth. You want more of them. Some countries have huge amounts of them. For instance, if India forms up somehow, they will have a whole bunch of primary and accepted cultures. The German Empire will have a few primary accepted. Spain has a couple. Ottomans don't. It's kind of bad for them. It's kind of strange how France has French-Canadian as a primary culture, considering they control none of that territory, basically. That's not really relevant. You get what I'm saying here. Primary culture is good. You want more of those. Mexico took Oklahoma, and that's all we are talking about today. So, I hope that answers any sort of thought or question you've ever had about politics. And if you're here to try and figure out what the hell this does, bad news. You didn't get it today. If you have any further questions, or you want to see me tackle a specific topic on this game, make sure to ask me in the comments. As ever, likes and subscribes are greatly appreciated. And with that being said, I'll see you next time on another exciting episode.